So I think in the future, being a town councillor is a pretty sexy job. It's almost like being a gang leader, like you would have, knowing the crew and knowing what's possible and sussing things out and beating the big boys in the games. I quite like that.
But I think that as we develop biotechnology, we'll start to see microbial gardening. We'll start to see guerrilla gardening of tiny, tiny plots.
I found reconnection with my local neighbours. I found to have time to talk to people over in my front yard. I found, a more local existence than I was living before. And
hello and welcome to Cyber Salon. This is our second event in our horizon scanning series called the Tales from Cyber Salon. We're very interested in the high street. We would like to find out more about your views on it, but we know that high street is in deep, deep trouble. We lost about 5,000 shops over the last few years. We lost over 250,000 jobs in about 36 months. So there's obviously very rapid change and disruption. And it's a topic dear to everybody's heart because, most of us had their first dates on the high street and remember first jobs in the shops. So what will happen to the high street when that will hollow out? So the impact on communities and the impact on commerce is only half of it, but the emotional impact is what we're really exploring. So I'm very excited about today's events. I'm Eva Pascoe, I'm chair of Cyber Salon, and I will be supporting the two chairs, Ben Greenaway and STEPHENORAM. And wonderful three experts, Priya, Prakash, and Paul Wilson, and Rachel Armstrong, will be helping us to rethink, reimagine, and reshape the vision. So future, but near future. So at that point, I would like to hand over to Benjamin. Can you introduce the speakers?
Yeah, hi. So tonight's panel are all on the screen at the moment. We can introduce them. We'll have a quick, little bit of a background bio as to where we are for tonight's event. On my right is Priya Prakash. Priya, hello.
Hello everyone. Great to see you this evening. So I was just very interested in this topic because I've been looking more and more the connection between the high street and how we relate to things like climate emergency. So I feel the high street has really got an interesting place in our hearts and minds to kind of create new conversations with people on how we can connect the supply chain, the algorithms we use, the energy we use. And I'm really looking forward to the stories that the writers have put together.
That's great. And below Priya, I have Rachel Armstrong, also on my right.
Hello, everyone. It's really great to be here. The stories are really exciting, so I know you're going to have a fantastic time. I'm Professor of Experimental Architecture at Newcastle University. And to be very honest with you, I don't think about the high street very much because my interest is in the more than human world, the vision of society after the human or the eco scene has happened. And so my idea of a high street would be more like a marketplace, not quite like a Star Wars Episode 1 bar scene, but the queerer the better, and a bit more like bring and buy gardening. You got to look after the soil with your trash and not always getting what you want and not really knowing how to take something back. That for me is the future of the high street.
That's fabulous, fabulous. And joining them is Paul Wilson, who at the moment on your career, Paul, hi, there, I think, on my pattern.
hi, so I'm really pleased to be with all these people around me, some real experts, and I've been thinking a lot about how urban populations are growing enormously. World population goes up by about 2/3 by 2050, so it's almost a huge increase until we get to 9 billion on the planet by 2050, an increase of 1/3 from the 7 billion today. And how could we use technology to help alleviate the pressures that are coming on our urban systems? And I've been very involved in playing around with 5G in different test beds and creating something called UK 5G around exploring the positive role of technology in the future of cities and in our rapidly urbanizing world.
was that part of the Birmingham, of the Bristol deployment, Paul?
At one point, I set up something called Bristol is Open, which was a joint venture between the University of Bristol and Bristol City Council. And then now there are about 30 projects similar-ish to that in different parts of the country, ranging from smart junctions in Manchester to a smart city, a smart port in Aberdeen, and various things like that.
Fantastic, fantastic. So around our panel and behind the tales from the Cyber Salon series, of course, are our writers. So in our first event, those of you that joined the first event, I was one of those writers. It was our first event. We were just getting going. I sort of stretched myself and had to go. But for this event, we've been fortunate enough to have time to run an open call, to take the ideas from Priya's materials and Paul's and Rachel's and have an open call for writers. Stephen and I went through a selection process. We received slightly more than a dozen stories for the night, whittled those down to a short list of 5 or 6, whittled that down to a short list of 4. And those 4 writers and the panel have met prior to tonight to help explore the ideas that they were bringing up, that the panel wanted to get together, to look at the stories and to see, well, how much scope have we been able to cover and what more might we want to be able to do. So that's just part of the process of Tales from the Cyber Salon, is both mixing the stories in with the experts before you see them and hopefully providing a deeper context for those tales and a more enriched conversation on the night. But we do have, and I'll just quickly introduce you all, Vaughan Stanger on my other right, left, there we go, Vaughan, hello Vaughan, who will be reading his story first. George, there we go, who's just turned his camera on, emerged from the darkness of his high street. George Jacobs, who will be reading his story second. And then STEPHENORAM, who, as well as being, as say, co-host and part of the selection process for the writers, and is, as you know, also a writer, his story will be reading third, and then we'll play Jane's story as well. And we'll go through the stories. Stephen will introduce us to the telling of the tales part of the night. And then, of course, we'll be back to the panel and to the audience questions to discuss the issues that they raise and the topics that they cover. So, Stephen, set our story scene for us, please.
I will. So you've done quite a bit already, Ben, which is great. There's probably a couple of things to say about the stories. They're designed to entertain, so please feel it's okay to be entertained. But also there may be things in there that spark a few thoughts in your head that you can then sort of bring forth in the Q&A afterwards. I'm sure the panelists themselves will raise a few things. But so there's a sort of dual purpose going on here. One, to be entertained, and the other is to get those cogs working and to sort of throw into the mix some of the stuff that comes to mind. Okay, so Vaughan, it's over to you to read us our first story, which is called Little Shop That Could. And I'll let you introduce it and read. Okay, everybody.
The Little Shop That Could. Milena stared at the flashing sign hovering above the exhibition's entrance, then glanced over her shoulder. Mum, why is it called Moths? MOTHS stands for the Museum of the High Street. I did say that's where we're going. What's the High Street? You've heard of Amazon? Milena nodded. Well, the High Street was like a mini Amazon arranged on either side of a road. The double doors swept open to reveal a long, gritty floored hallway with lots of signs and doors and tall windows. Fluffy hollow clouds floated beneath the pale blue ceiling. So, are those shops? Her mum chuckled. Yeah, that's right. Your gran worked in one selling cosmetics and medicines. Milena's gran joined them, having successfully exchanged crypto for something called hard cash outside. She pointed towards a blue sign with curvy white lettering. Boots was the last shop to close where I live. She sounded sad. A weird-looking robot made of metal rods wobbled up to them. One of its wheels was spinning like an app that had crashed. Its cyber eyes blinked a greeting. Can I help you? Its cheerful voice made Milena smile. No thanks, said her mum. We don't need a guide. It's not too late to change your... No thanks. The robot wobbled away, searching for other visitors. Milena had counted 5 so far, all adults. What was that thing? A shopping trolley, said her mum. We won't need it. Too pushy, her gran said. Malena's mum groaned. How about we do some window shopping? Whatever that was. Okay. After they'd walked past several shop fronts, Malena pointed to one topped by a bright green sign. What did Oxfam sell? Her gran sighed. Second-hand clothes and books, mostly. What's second-hand? Stuff people donated because they didn't need it anymore. Malena wrinkled her nose. Who would buy that? Other people. The frown deepened. But why? The two adults exchanged glances. The mum said, Oxfam helped poor people. Oh, I see. At least Malena thought she did. She knew poor people were extinct, a bit like moths and tigers, and both Amazons. Can we go in? I'm not sure. Nonsense, said Malena's gran. We're here to shop. Malena followed her inside. Ignoring the rails of hollow clothes, she headed straight for the tall shelves at the back. Eyes wide, she said, Are those real books? Her gran shook her head. I shouldn't think so. Malena reached up for one with a statue of a tiger on its cover. Her mum snapped, Don't touch! The book disappeared. Her gran laughed. Too late. Malena's mum sighed. I knew that would happen. Outside the shop, the wonky-wheeled trolley waited for them, its cyber eyes still blinking. The hollow book floated within its metal frame. Please pay for your shopping after you leave this exhibition. Both adults chuckled. Her gran said, Exit the gift shop. Malena didn't understand what was so funny, but it didn't matter. She had been shopping. That's what counted. The gift shop contained lots of shelves and clothes rails, all empty. An ubi hummed in the corner. Malena frowned because their trolley was now empty. Where's my book? The gran smiled. We have to pay for it first. You know, I could still grab the code so we could ubi at home, her mum said. That wouldn't cost anything. Malena crossed her arms, but it wouldn't be shopping. Her gran nodded vigorously. Malena's right. Don't worry, dear. I'll pay. Are you sure? It would be my pleasure. Malena's mum sighed. Okay, just this once. When her gran fed a plastic note into the indicated slot, the ubi purred like Malena's virtual cat. Her mum frowned as though she now regretted the visit. No wonder this place is closing next month. No one really misses shopping. I do, said her gran. Ha! You just miss eating out. Well, yes, that too. Malena frowned. What's eating out? The gran replied. After the shops disappeared, people still went to the high street to eat. But the great pandemic of 31 ended that. Soon afterwards, the government gave every household an ubi, so there wasn't any reason to eat out anymore. But your gran loves a touch of nostalgia, Malena's mum said. She thought you might enjoy this exhibition. The gran gave Malena a serious look. You did enjoy it, didn't you? Malena nodded, but her attention was now on the delivery tray. The ubi had stopped purring. Her book slid out. She snatched it up before it disappeared too. Every page delivered magic. She gazed in wonder at the statues of lions and elephants and other extinct things. Her mum tapped the book's cover. Our ubi could make any of those. Malena shook her head. I've got a much better idea. She didn't want something made for her. She wanted to make something for herself. For that, she'd need some modelling clay. Their ubi could provide it, but only if she recycled other stuff first. Unless her gran topped up her feedstock allowance. And once she'd made her animals, she would need somewhere to display them. Happily, she had an idea about that. The elderly man accompanying the boy frowned. Are you sure you want it? The boy nodded. Why? Because it wasn't made by an ubi. Jamie's got two already. The man muttered something about a fad. Please. The boy didn't seem to mind that the unicorn wasn't one of Malena's better efforts. Keeping up with demand was difficult. The supply of clay was no longer a problem now that the ubi which owned the Moss building had approved her business plan, but she could only skip so much school. The man turned to Malena. Is this thing really an ubi knot? She smiled at him. Yes, it is. He sighed while placing his money on the counter. Malena wrapped the unicorn in paper and handed it to the boy. Once they'd gone, she waved at her gran, who was standing on the opposite side of the road, but too busy to respond while welcoming families into the cafe. The high street was booming again. During their journey home, Malena asked her gran about fads. Within a week, she opened a new shop selling second-hand ubi knots. Thank you.
That's brilliant. Thanks, Vaughan. So many hop-off points in your story. There's one that's just a little tucked away there about poor people becoming extinct, which I'd love to anyhow, I won't go there, but it's just be interesting. Yes, a robot that makes everything. For those of you who haven't spotted in the chat, the stories are on Medium, and there's a link there to Vaughan's story as well, so you can read it at your leisure later as well. So,
Viral Advertising by George Jacobs. The City Connect train breathed to a stop at Central Station. All the passengers got on, Wren included. This was the innermost stop. The train would now head back the way it had come, till it reached the outermost suburbs, then repeat, programmed to execute the journey endlessly. There was but one spoke on the City Connect wheel. Wren made his way through the crowd to the e-bus stop marked for City Section A. There were only so far the trains could penetrate the urban sprawl, what with planning permission how it was, making roads a necessity still. The driverless bus pulled up, and Wren boarded along with about 20 others. He was dressed casually, doing his best to be just another face in the crowd, nothing anyone would remember. His phone buzzed as it linked with the e-bus, but Wren found a seat before he took it out of his pocket. He had only a few seconds left to choose whether to play a game of Fruit Crusher or have the £2 e-bus ride fee deducted from his account, before the latter option was chosen by default. He pressed to accept the game. It took only 30 seconds for Wren to fail the game's first level. "Do you wish to continue?" asked the app. "Only £1 for 3 continues." No, Wren didn't want to continue. Yes, he was sure. His terrible score was then displayed in comparison to everyone else who had played on the e-bus that day. Judging by the score of the top 5, some people had spent a lot more than £1 on continues. Wren closed the app and dimmed the brightness. It was vital his phone didn't heat up enough to damage the payload. People got on and people got off. Most people were on their phones, the bus pretty silent. But the e-bus chat was buzzing away with comments, and Wren quickly muted it. He rode the e-bus all the way into the city centre, to the High Street. That's where his target was. The centre was busy, always was. Cafes, salons, games rooms, pick-up points, amongst much else. A hubbub of conversation, laughter and music filled the air, punctuated by the occasional cheer as someone won a match in the arcade. All the businesses were local, though you'd not know that from the signs. Local authority regulations meant everything within the city centre limits had to be independent and locally owned. It didn't say anything about what those local businesses could advertise, however. Wren walked past hairdressers whose windows were covered with interactive adverts for fast food chains, and newsstands emblazoned with QR codes, promoting out-of-town car dealerships. His phone buzzed from notifications from the centre Wi-Fi, promising discounts, loyalty schemes, and links to online catalogues. Beneath Wren's feet, vast warehouses thrummed with activity, robots moving items from storage to lifts, which transported them up to the privately owned pick-up points as and when they were ordered. The north end of the High Street was dominated by Dottie's coffee shop. Dottie had a popular online presence, marketing herself as everyone's lovable grandma. That online presence was something she'd been able to leverage into the best corporate sponsorships, which in turn made her the queen of the city centre. Most local businesses had no hope. They couldn't afford the city rents without risk-averse, big business support. Heading past the wraparound tablet and phone adverts that danced across the interior screens, Wren found a table at Dottie's and ordered a latte through the app. Around him, people sipped their coffees, a good many of them playing with electronic gadgets. One corner of the shop was given over to VR, where a large group of teenagers were playing the latest game. Wren felt a mixture of pity and loathing for them. From Dottie's app, Wren ordered and opened up the master catalogue. Dottie's offered the opportunity to trial electronic goods from several international chains. If patrons liked them, they could order them directly through the app, getting a referral discount, and collect them from the pickup point just outside. "Your coffee, sir." A young waitress placed the drink on the table. "Thanks," said Wren. "Would you like to sample any of our products today? We have the new Nova S3, exclusive to Dottie's." "Actually, yes, I would like to test that phone, please." "No problem, sir. I'll have someone bring one to your table." Wren didn't have long to wait. Dottie's was a slick operation, despite the old lady branding. The phone was a nice bit of kit, very powerful, very stylish, very expensive. There was no danger of theft, though. Anything removed from the shop would brick itself and summon the police automatically. As subtly as he could, Wren removed the memory wafer from his own phone and transferred it to the Nova S3, popping the slot cap and closing it with a practiced motion of his hands, his baggy hoodie shielding the operation from Dottie's cameras. Next, it was time to drain the battery. Wren activated everything he could think of that was heavy on the power, continuing to tap away at the phone, ordering another coffee, then a croissant. At last, the phone flashed a warning that it needed charging. Wren got up, handed the phone to one of the waiters, and then went to catch his e-bus. He was on City Connect by the time he received a push notification from the local news site. Dotty's had been hacked. For over half an hour, patrons had been redirected from the master catalogue. The tweaks to the search algorithms had been subtle, taking time to notice, funneling customers away from the big businesses and towards the online portals of local shops. Before Dotty's staff realised what had occurred, hundreds of items had been ordered from independent sellers for home delivery, rather than bought from Dotty's sponsors for pickup. The news had reached out to some of the beneficiaries, but so far no one had claimed responsibility. Business owners were professing ignorance of the entire thing, though Dotty's corporate backers had promised to get to the bottom of things. Ren smiled. By now the memory wafer would have disintegrated from the little heat generated by charging the phone, but its work had already been done, uploading Ren's program to Dotty's cloud. They wouldn't get to the bottom of it. Ren was just a good Samaritan doing what he could. This wasn't the first thing he'd done, and it wouldn't be the last. He wouldn't let the high street kill the true independents. Thank you very much.
That's fantastic. Thank you, George. George. It's a great story. I always wondered whether you're just testing out with everybody whether your idea of how you might go about something might work. But anyhow, Rachel, you are going to give us some thoughts, aren't you?
Yes, I just got a few thoughts on those first two stories. They strike me as both being portraits of the same beast, a cannibal capitalism, eating people's attention and consuming social activity. So they're quite malignant in many ways. For me, in the little shop that could, I just loved how shopping itself became commodified. It was so materialist that it had become dematerialized, this kind of Ouroboros, an ultimate parody ending in a gift shop. Where the snake eats its own tail. It's just absolutely wonderful. And there's also something about these shopping trolleys, the Ubis, like a circus performance clown, turning logic on itself and, becoming part of a spectacle that you're not really quite sure how serious it is or not. And also, I just love then the kind of grubbiness becoming a new kind of commodity and the value of labor that slides out of this kind of feast of dematerialization. And I really end up hoping that it becomes something more than the Ouroboros starting again, consuming this time secondhand goods and things that are made by labor. And you're left with this feeling that you're just about to negotiate a new kind of economy. So really love that. I love the whole thing just eating itself. And then with George's viral advertising, man, that was a parody. I mean, it's like we are at that moment where the change happens. That we can't hear the story live because actually the system has been hacked. And I love this building up to the tipping point. With a digital lubricant of commodity itself becoming the Achilles heel of its own destruction. I love the everydayness and almost lethargy of tipping points of order. We expect them to come with some kind of fanfare, and it's just the ordinariness of that really feels very unsettling. And yeah, just absolutely love the fact that tech failed. I love the helicopter intervention, and it really felt like we just found a message from an archive that told us about this tipping point as if it'd been recorded by hand. So absolutely fantastic, really intriguing, and I love these big chunks of irony taken out of the cannibal capitalism beast.
That's brilliant. Thanks, Rachel.
It's interesting actually that was really chiming with the second poll we wanted to launch for this evening. So I'm going to throw that up as well as part of our break. Hopefully we can check all our mics for the second half. How have you most recently been using our high street? Is it just a capitalist endeavor, or is there more going on? And I'd really like to tie this down to just in our last 2 weeks, so it can also be telling us, how frequently you're visiting. So, for what purpose have you most visited the High Street in the past 2 weeks? Is it retail and shopping? Is it for business and home admin, going to the bank, going to the post office, that kind of thing? Just to socialise, for something else, or you haven't even been there in 2 weeks? It's not something you're visiting that frequently. So it is entirely the dystopic shopping nightmare that we've all been commenting on there. Results, 50% people still visiting for retail and shopping. No surprise, I can imagine, but let's see what the second half has to offer.
Okay, so this is one of these really weird moments where I introduce myself, but I'm going to read my story now, which is called The Crunch. So I won't tell you to pay attention because that would be it'd be even weirder. So The Crunch. Jake's mouth is full of toothpaste when his gran calls. He quickly rinses, pops his toothbrush in its holder, and his oral health is broadcast to his fan base. Hey, she says. Good luck, not that you'll need it. Thank you. He blurs the screen. Sorry, I need to get dressed. In the background, his gran is going on about how much better things are compared to her day. She loves being able to see her doctor, dentist, and chemist all in one visit. It's old news, but he loves her and lets her ramble on. She can pop into the college or the library. The family entertainment is fantastic. And those shoppers' rooms where she can order clothes and stuff from all over the place and then return what she doesn't want are amazing. He brings back the visuals and she claps. You look wonderful, she says. Totally a town councillor in the making. And get noticed by Jerry, he thinks. Mustache, he says. Are we meeting in town for supper? Yep, full family, I heard. Great. Don't forget, if you lose, you'll shame us all. Me and your mother and your children when they come. It's a town that remembers. She winks. He shudders and leaves the flat as quickly as he can, confident that his best friend Mark can help boost his popularity. After all, a trend-predicting data entrepreneur with an eye for fashion might be exactly what he needs. Out on the streets, it's a lot busier than usual, but the border of the town centre seems to be coping admirably, recognising subscribers who are paid-up members and taking a fee from those who aren't. Mark's new house is in a surprising part of town, but then he does have an uncanny knack of moving into a place just before the rent becomes fully funded through a town planner regeneration project. As Jake approaches, he gathers the one free apple his health app allocates him from a communal tree and tears a strip of edible leaves from a vertical garden. Lunch. Mark is leaning against a lamppost, plugged in and charging. Ready? He asks. And raring, replies Jake. Let's go. Along the way, Mark pauses at one of the recent pop-ups generated by the creative partnerships between cognitive computers, artists, and entrepreneurs. Two of the town's artificial creatives are playing chess, using the shoppers as pieces on a board scattered with squares that contain surprise prizes. 2 minutes, says Mark, as he takes footage to help him turn the public data sets into a product for tourists. So long as this smart town planner keeps flexing the business rates and placing new pop-ups to increase the footfall, the data will constantly change and I'll keep making a living, he says, followed by a big grin. Good for you, says Jake, tapping his foot. Maybe one of those prizes is a date with Jerry. Stop it, come on, I need to get there. They walk quickly to the local college where Jake waves to the crowd, inwardly worrying about being rejected and disgraced. No room for failure, as his gran would say. The high-tech startups recently housed in the local train station have fitted the candidate rooms in the college with immersive virtual reality and popularity prediction equipment. He steps into VR and chooses trousers, shirts, jackets, and shoes. Each combination he tries gains a positive prediction, indicating that he should be a highly successful influencer and an advocate for their town. His gran will be pleased. Trouble is that no outfit passes the threshold for sustainability. He shifts to the second-hand clothes on offer. virtually swapping a pocket here for a pocket there and an arm here for an arm there. It's all about personalised style. None of his creations do well in the predictions until he uses the frilly collar and cuffs from a dress shirt and attaches them to a suit jacket. It's a VR hit. He orders the clothes, and 30 minutes later, the jacket and shirt are delivered to the room, along with the wide selection of new items he's already chosen. He sets to work on the different combinations that Mark offers until the predictions are high enough to press send, and waits to see how Jerry will react. Jerry doesn't respond. He hates me. I'm finished. You're a style guru. Go with your gut, says Mark, as he gets ready to program the stitch bot to attach the collar and cuffs to the jacket. What do you want? A place on the council or Jerry in your bed? Both. Glutton. Ambitious. As soon as the bot finishes stitching, Jake swaps the jacket he's wearing for the hybrid and faces the cameras. The predictions shoot up, but Jerry pierces Jake's elation with a stinging comment. Boring. His grand comments too. Keep it popular. Remember Uncle Frank. He doesn't, but he's heard whispered stories about the family having to disown him and delete him from the census data. He wants to please Jerry, but his grand's plea to please the crowds has hit home. Here, let me, he says to Mark, and cuts a piece of shimmering insulation material that's growing on the walls. He hand stitches a series of patches, making them visible and artistic. Meanwhile, the material on the wall repairs itself. The crowds love it, and so does Jerry. The call comes. Jake will be incorporated into the augmented reality parade that evening, and as a newly recognised high influencer, he is eligible to be voted onto the town council and to have a say in the metadata which shapes the town planner. Jerry comments, fabulous to see such originality. Kill all celebrity copycatting. Jake laughs with delight and runs a final test to make sure nobody else has submitted a similar outfit. They haven't, so he confirms his choice with the town planner to prevent anyone copying and relaxes. Lounging on the sofa, he considers his apple. It is the perfect icon for his town. Simple, natural, and healthy. He takes a bite. The crunch is sweet and refreshing, like life itself. He grins. Mate, we did it.
Great, Stephen. Thank you. Allow me to introduce in virtual Jane Norris, the time-traveling milkman.
The Time-Travelling Milkman by Jane Norris. The opening question my boss asked me was, what is the first material you meet in life, something essential to our survival, the only substance we both produce and consume? I knew he was talking about milk, but I hadn't quite thought of it that way. He was right, though. It's odd stuff, milk. It often reveals how we treat the world around us. It shows how people's attitudes to food change their high street. Milk, our most intimate material, is one we have a strange relationship with. Before I started in this business, milk was a living being. Back before the Industrial Revolution, I didn't have a job. People only drank human milk. That milk was a vital bridge to physical independence and survival. It contained the wisdom of my family bacterial resistance, offered nourishment for my bones, lactose sugars to grow my brain. The live and volatile being that was cow's milk was only given occasionally to the sick. Dairies had traditionally sold cheese, not milk. My first job was in 1810 in London. I sold a new luxury material, cow's milk. I worked in a small cow shed with 5 cows, and my customers knew my name and the cows' names, and which cows from the shed along the Strand in London gave the best quality milk. Those were good times. On Saints' days, when I had some time off, I'd walk across the fields to St. Martin's Church to chat to a girl I knew. Everyone in those days knew that milk's flavour changed with the seasons. People understood milk as alive with its own characteristics and demands. Back then, your milk would have gone off in a day. But 50 years later, in the mid-19th century, attitudes to milk had changed. I was kicked out of my job. The rows of the cowsheds from St. Martin's in the Fields to the Strand were cleared to make London supposedly more hygienic. People said milk was now unhealthy and dangerous. It was blamed for the epidemics of typhoid, scarlet fever, and tuberculosis sweeping Europe. I remember the spring of 1862 when I heard from a mate in a coffee shop that Louis Pasteur had learnt to heat milk to high temperatures for short periods, killing the dangerous microbes in milk. This was good news, as it would keep me in some employment. But the heat that killed the bad microbes killed the good microbes too. In fact, it killed milk. I was sad to see our relationship with milk change. It was no longer seen as a living being with microbacteria to aid digestion and stimulate the immune system. Once it was dead, it was sold in sterilised glass bottles. And it certainly lasted longer. But it was now just a product to make money. I got a job working in one of the big dairies out of town that collected milk from the farmers, treated it, and delivered it in. I just had to put the right number of bottles on the right doorstep. This was a stable job for many decades. The only thing that changed was that I swapped my horse and cart for the electric milk float and used to whir up and down the increasingly busy streets of London. I got up early to try and miss the rush hour traffic as people travelled to and from the big offices and shops they worked in. But things change. People's attitudes to milk have shifted once more. Milk production became so industrialised that I didn't make enough money on my personalised rounds. So I lost that job and now work at the Sainsbury's local, stacking big plastic cartons of milk into the cooling cabinets. Some people still buy big 2-litre containers, but the numbers are reducing. They have found that drinking this dead white liquid has led to lactose intolerances. People are starting to avoid it. I notice the shelves of almond milk are increasing. I guess as a response to this, the big industrial companies have converted dead milk into hundreds of different commercial opportunities. Milk is now marketed as probiotic medicine by artificially adding the microbes back in. It is fortified with vitamins, suggesting it was lacking. It has had its fat reduced as if it had too much or the wrong sort. It has been homogenized, as if somehow it was unacceptably diverse. But this could be different if people respected the live and transitory nature of the living being that is milk. If people wanted to benefit from cow's milk, we need to keep it clean, fresh, and alive. We would then know the many benefits it brings to digestion, eczema, asthma, calcium deficiency, lactose intolerance, and perhaps Alzheimer's and many other chronic conditions. But this would require a different relationship with cows. It would mean caring for our milk herds, ensuring they were naturally healthy, giving cows fresh, clean grass and hay to eat, not processed grain pellets full of antibiotics. This would oblige us to stop factory farming and would then change our use of town centres. Small milk herds would have to move closer to the consumer again, as the milk would have a shorter shelf life once more. We would need small fields with a handful of cows and a shed selling fresh milk, where local high streets now have empty shuttered Poundland stores. People might come again to know mine and my cows' names and be able to tell the difference in taste between their creamy summer and thinner winter milk. In a post-pandemic world, as many people continue to work and shop from home, local high streets need to produce healthier food more locally. Live milk could in turn enliven our high streets. We might start to respect milk again, understand it as seasonal with its own rights. And I might get my happiest job back, working on the Strand with my 5 cows.
I love that. Love that. Such a shame that Jane couldn't be with us tonight, but it's wonderful to at least have her story for the record and on the Medium page too. So Priya, if I can invite you back to make a few comments on those second half 2 stories, please.
Sure, Ben. So with Crunch, I think what I really enjoyed was the way Stephen makes the physical world and the online world and brings those two together. And having seen the outage today we had with the internet as well, it's really interesting which parts were still live and which parts were dead. And I was thinking, what would that mean in the real world if we had like a power outage? But what would it be like for a real power outage? Like right now, we have, like Google and others pretty much being the landlords of the space that we have online. What's really nice with what Mark did with his town councillor hat on, or trying to go for that, is he's reclaiming power from these big tech companies by using his local town almost as a platform and having his fans and his grandmother and his friends all supporting him to have the kind of lifestyle which I would say, if you see people like the community on Depop, which has just got sold to Etsy, these are like early indicators where, new and shiny is probably less interesting, but the whole personalized style where people are sampling just like music, sampling lifestyles. And what I love about what Steve mentioned also is the idea that Mark has managed to go to that part of the neighborhood, which is quite prescient, that he figures out. He's very much in the know on where the rent is going to be, almost the rent's going to be very low when there's this regeneration happening. So he's able to ride the wave of regeneration and all these new projects on bringing the high street back together. So I think in the future, being a town councillor is a pretty sexy job. It's almost like being a gang leader, like you would have, knowing the crew and knowing what's possible and sussing things out and beating the big boys in their games. I quite like that, this idea of taking power back. Also, what I found fascinating was his relationship with his grandmother, how his grandmother kind of almost felt quite comfortable, because in many of these stories, we always have this generation divide between the young and the old. And I found it really elegant the way Stephen brought together the two generations, because they had common talking points. And also what is quite fascinating is the grandmother could access all these services all from the same place, which very much feels familiar. It's nothing like it's a big shift. It's just like bringing things together, which I thought was quite an interesting way of joining the dots. Little steampunk things like the lamppost charging. I'm a fan of taking existing infrastructure and reusing it. I thought that was really cool. And also this idea of playing chess, like playing with public data sets. I'm sure Paul will be speaking later. We'll talk about the whole thing that we've had as a designer. You always be working with open data and the promise of open data, but they're like so ancient. You have the CSV files from 2000. You can't do anything as a developer with some of this ancient data. But I think what was interesting here is somehow Stephen managed to make data sexy again and relevant by having people trade the live footfall data and other forms of data as mementos of their time in the high streets. I think there were some really interesting ideas. There's quite a few ideas out there. And I think one of the things about the VR and, bringing this thing of the virtual and the real back, I felt like, I don't know if you follow some of these funny hashtags on Twitter where it's like 7 income streams from Gumroad, and looking at how people can make different kind of income streams. It's almost like taking that whole Twitter 7 income stream fetish and bringing it in the real world, but also like, a hark to the Maslow's hierarchy of needs of that social proof and social currency, where ultimately it doesn't matter, you have to still get that approval from your community. You still have to have that popular, unfortunate populist kind of element in order to survive. So I thought these are some very well observed emotional human traits which still remains relevant in the near future. And moving towards Jane's story about milk, this almost for me feels like Alice in Wonderland approach, where you take milk and follow it down the whole of, the whole where milk came from originally and where it's landed, and how milk can really change our relationship with nature. So again, as a designer, I'm quite interested in how we make the interconnections between human, non-human, sentient animals much more, bring it out together. And I think Jane really kind of hit a chord there, starting with human milk as, almost the first example of, sounds horrible, circular economy. But then, can we kind of outsource that to the cows? And then we lost our relationship with the cows themselves. And I think, making that whole thing as much more human and using the idea of employment, the way the jobs change over time. So what kind of new jobs will the high street create in the future if we get more sustainable and we bring back some of those things of people having a direct provenance and following where the milk comes from, or it's coming from Strand, because we know there are 6 cows out there. I thought it was quite fascinating, taking almost like the Hackney City Farm approach, where you can go and see a pig, a real pig, which is like it's quite rare in a city, but bringing that whole element in a kind of subliminal way through milk was fascinating. And I think using health almost as a Trojan horse to change our relationship with the city, with the environment, and also with the technology, I think is very insightful from what Jane came up with.
Yeah, it does bring out quite a lot of the stories of our high street currently, right? One, that they're historic, the idea that there was, a milk shed on the Strand, just that image alone sort of burst the bubble of the high street that I knew as growing up, that was the only high street. There was a high street before that, there'll be a high street after that, and it starts to ask the questions about, well, what are the dynamics of change? What caused change in that old high street that brought the one that I grew up with? What are these changes that are happening right now that I'm seeing for my, upcoming high street? And it was just such a lovely little elegy to time and to time passing too. It's a shame. And if you're watching Jane, or if you see this later, we hope you're feeling much better of starting to. Thanks, Priya. Thanks very much. So we're trying to open the story back up now, or the night up now, to the rest of the conversation. And Paul, if you're sitting there with a button on your video mute, thank you. About now is a good time to rejoin us, as as we've set the scene here for a high street of commerce versus a high street of unknown and as yet fully described spaces, potentially urban renewed spaces, potentially social ones, political ones. And I suppose I'm going to sort of ask you here, she's like, not that there's necessarily a tension between the two, but where might we be finding some good examples of all these different spaces synthesizing? And as they change, we know they're going to change, but some good examples of high streets that are doing that now that we can maybe jump off from.
I'm going to make a sort of philosophical statement first, and then give you a practical examples after that. For me, I heard all these stories as sort of to do with our relationship between cities coming together, creating power and scale in scale, and then enjoying that at times and thinking it was clever, and at times wishing we could get away from it and experience our own individual experience from it. So in Ubi, you have this sort of technology which is in your house, universal basic income, I noticed, and Ubi. And so we've all created equality with Ubi, but we're now atomized at home. We're away from the power. The power's been put in our houses, and the Ubi can make everything. And it was sanctioned by the government in 31 after the pandemic. So we're now isolated though, and I don't know if we want to be isolated. We kind of, we're drawn to be together. Like, we have this love-hate relationship between city and nature. And nature is good, but it's boring, isn't it? Oh no, it's not boring. It's the life that keeps us alive, the city. But we have this dichotomy going on with all of us. And in George, I thought the independent shops beat the big retailers. So again, the independent small people won. in Steve's, it's interesting that democracy still wins out. You have to get elected, but actually we really want to go and play with the big toy, which is called the town planner, and we get to shape the town planner's data input. But it's actually the democracy that decides. So again, it's kind of like we want to be big, but we actually want to have power over the big. And then in Jane's, again, the bit that stuck out for me was the one on the microbes inside the milk bring health. And we kind of, the big system took the diversity out of the milk and just made it bland. But actually, when we allowed it to be organic, it brought in microbes that created health. So all the time there's this tension between big and coming together to achieve something, and small and feeling a sense of ownership and power. But we're fascinated, drawn like moths to a flame, aren't we? We want the big, we hate the big. We want the city, we hate the city. We want the countryside, it's boring.
Why is it that I feel you're drawing this metaphor out to a point you've got lined up for us, Paul?
Right. Okay. Thank you. So I just want to tell a little story that I thought was great, because, of course, technology is all around us. But one of the funnest things we've done. I live in Bristol. We've done in Bristol is we turned one of the hilliest streets, Park Street, into a water slide, and we put a 100-meter water slide down that, and you applied to go on it. 100,000 people applied. There were 100 golden tickets given, like Willy Wonka, and everybody wanted a golden ticket, and 100 people got a golden ticket. They got to go on the slide. 100,000 people came and watched the people going down on squeezy, and water, going at incredibly high speed by the bottom, creating a real big health and safety risk. And everybody had a party and they loved it. And we had reclaimed the streets. We'd taken the cars off the streets. The local businesses, many of which are independent retailers, boomed, whilst everybody actually humanized the streets. So if I was to have one bugbear, it would be the car, which actually stops us from using our high streets, because they seem to exist more for cars and parking than they do for us. And there's a lot of exciting changes coming, I think, as we regain our influence over streets and see micromobility move up, of which is coming in cities everywhere. And we begin to fall out of love with a car, which really dominated most of the last half of the last century. But you can see it losing its grip in our psyche, if not our physicality just yet. But you can see it's going, with air quality zones coming in Birmingham and in Bath and other places around the place. So I think we will begin to decar. We will re-people the streets. I have a feeling we'll use digital technology to have fun in our high streets. I think we will reclaim them for independent shops more than vast scaled businesses.
Well, you picked up on one of the questions that I know George, if he's still there in a video black hole with audio, at least this time, I know George was trying to ask questions in his story about the transport and how that city network manages to maintain a high street like community-like behavior on the inside. And he talks of a network of trains on the outside leading up to a more town-like shape on the inside.
Well, okay. I think I'd really want to respond to the actual nature issue. I'm not a car fan, but I am. I like walking. Like the psychogeography of cities, which helps us read spaces, belong to spaces. And I think we've made a dichotomy between the city space, mobility and nature. And I actually think that what we've called nature, relating to agriculture, relating to farming, is actually going to be part of the city experience in the future. I mean, we already have things like green walls and parks, but I think that as we develop biotechnology, we'll start to see microbial gardening. We'll start to see guerrilla gardening of tiny, tiny plots. A curb and kind of patches around tree roots will be like fields. And so I think that we will get a lot more nature presence. We'll do it in window boxes. So we're thinking, we're used to carving the city up into particular blocks of space. And I think that we're actually going to micro-miniaturize that, a bit like the way we've micro-miniaturized computers. And that's actually going to start to change atmosphere. With that, I think we will have more physical forms of public transport, and then we'll have more electric-based with renewables linking cities together. So, and I think that there will be ways of people working together to help people with mobility issues. I think it will be a community effort and not just left up for one person to get on with it. Because I think that once we start relating and belonging to place, and when we actually start to invest in it and plant it and see it start to come to life on its own, it really builds a sense of community. So, I mean, that may not be around the corner, but that's my wish.
I love that idea, that just the idea that we could chop up London into little bits of micro farm would be fantastic. But is that something that we'll just do because nobody will be able to buy enough space to even put a house or a flat on it? That much I certainly feel to believe that. Or is that a legislative thing? Is that something we have to decide, like, as a democracy, to want to do? How can we bring about that change?
Well, I'll just quickly respond to that, because I think it's a guerrilla act, because at the moment nobody owns those plots, and so it's about land ownership, and that's a tipping point we can actually start to move into. So
similarly to George's story, this is a guerrilla action. This is okay, yeah, great, love it.
Yeah, I want to add to George's story, because I could totally relate to some of the behaviors. Having recently gone, last time also I mentioned in our meetup, going to Apple Store and surreptitiously using their charger for free and checking things out. I mean, that's a thing, a habit and behavior that I do, and I thought it was very well observed. And I feel some of the things that we are talking about, it might feel, to be absolutely honest, a classic middle class idea of what the future should be, where everybody's growing their own food and drinking organic milk and everything's very lovely jubbly. But actually we do have a strong socioeconomic divide. We have people coming from different cultures. We have people coming as refugees. We have a lot of interesting socioeconomic issues to deal with, where people's cultures, values, belief systems might be quite different from what some of the dominant groups would think is good for the future, for the environment. So I think going back to George's story, what is heartening is tapping on some existing behaviors that people already have, because whenever you create new technology, like what Paul was saying, the problem is many of these things don't get adopted. We spend a lot of money, and we know that from Innovate UK and other places, there's so much money spent on funding so many pilots and trials on High Street. I think Eva knows most of this, but many of them fail. And we should step back saying technology is a solution. What is the problem? But what are the existing habits and behaviors that we can tap upon and reuse that so people can try new lifestyles? And I really like Rachel's idea about the connection with nature, because the way we start redefining that relationship, whether it's with a millennial, with plants. I saw somebody saw Carolina making a comment about plants are the new pets. Absolutely. Like the way people related to parks during the pandemic was quite amazing. People have it was almost like an extended living room where people could meet up with each other. So it would be a shame if we didn't take some of these existing habits and behaviors, working from home, working some days at work, and we have to act fast, because these things, I'm not saying that people will change, but then having this half-hearted attempts in the high street is not going to cut the mustard anymore. So we really have to make use of this time, and the iron is still hot. That's what I would say as a designer, designing habits and behaviors.
That's interesting. So one of the questions in the Q&A here, or a two-part question from Vail, the second part talking about the high street. Can the high street as a destination be enjoyed without a fat wallet? And you're saying there, Priya, the park you enjoy without a fat wallet. I live in West Ealing. I look at my high street when I was answering my question at the beginning of the poll tonight. Which bit is my actual high street? And it's quite a distributed thing. There's a little bit of it here, there's a little bit of it over there, there's a little bit of it somewhere else. If I think of my park as a distributed thing, there's a little bit of it over here and a little bit of it over there. I enjoy all of that space. I think maybe we're less worried about the gathering of the high street as one specific retail focused space, and more, I think, and partly from in the first conversation we all had, about urban space in general. And this is the story of the high street and the decline of the high street seems to have prompted us all to ask questions about our more general urban space, whether it's our town or our neighborhood or our city.
And the one thing I think we've all experienced is the sort of revival of this 15-minute neighborhood. And I think that's been very special and precious to many of us during this last year, where we have found many of the things that, well, I mean, I have, maybe I'm just very fortunate, but you know, I found reconnection with my local neighbors. I found to have time to talk to people over in my front yard. I found, you know, a more local existence than I was living before. And I found that to be good. And I found that I didn't need to go to the shops as much as I did, beyond you know, some basic groceries, which I did, you know. But I think that rediscovery of the local has been a relief in many ways, and very, very heartwarming, actually.
Paul, I'm glad you came back in. The first part of Vale's question, I think you spoke about an example of when we met last time, which was how do we facilitate the inclusion of such independent outlets? So the ones really that George was talking about in his story as well. How do we facilitate the digital inclusion of independent outlets so that they have functional online presence to offer and promote their wares? I imagine the online part we could probably solve. It's the physical part afterwards. And there was which was the street in Bath? No, not in Bath.
Yes, Gloucester. Well, the road is called Gloucester Road.
Gloucester Road, that's
in Bristol, and it's more than a mile long, and the vast majority of shops are independently owned, and I suppose it's well known and makes people smile when they find that when Tesco's opened there was a riot there, and then I mean that was you know, famous, but then what the community did after that was it sort of agreed to go shoplifting in Tesco's en masse forever. And that Tesco's had more shoplifting in it than almost any other Tesco's that there is, allegedly, according to urban myth. And certainly the community thought that was fair game. And that street thrives as an independent shopping street, and is full of shops called things like Happy Tat, and you know, many other secondhand and community-based streets. It's been very successful. One thing it's created is a sense of local identity, that people don't feel, you know, like it's just a bunch of like by like brands. It's a community experience, and people are very, very proud of it and protect it very fiercely, actually.
Was it because of a change in rates, or was there a particular policy that keyed it off? How did it?
Yeah, I mean, the council takes a deliberate approach to the rates. It reduces rates for independently owned on that street.
So I guess one challenge we might have is, you know, how is that scalable, or how can that be ported to other towns and to other cities?
Yeah, and I think before we just get too hippyish about it, we also have a big shopping centre with all the brands in. You know, so you know, you want to go and do all your big brand names, you go to the shopping centre, and those things are not that far apart. And frankly, you know, speaking personally, I do a bit of both, but so both exist. I think there is a place for both, actually, but we've been one of the I'm told that's a relatively unique street, that with that many independent shops up and down.
I mean, ultimately, it comes to the decision on economics, as Rachel pointed out. You know, the micro and the focus on local is what we probably need to rethink. But UK is quite unusual that local taxes don't stay local. So London gathers a lot of taxes and doesn't see any of it, frankly, and contributes to feeding Birmingham, Manchester. I don't know about Bristol. Bristol's probably neutral. But there is a big imbalance, and there's a big area of poverty in London, which could be sorted out with keeping London taxes in London, but that's politically unacceptable. So frankly, the current situation we are in, it's something that we need to question, and we need to question at a very high level, because our own MP can do nothing, but at the minister level, they might actually do something. So I've been involved in this Bill Grimsey review for a number of years now. And one thing we noticed that the answers are quite simple, but they're political answers. So redistributing of taxes nationwide is good in terms of patriotism, but it's very unlikely to actually help, because only local eye can direct the local tax correctly. Otherwise, it's only random, corrupt, and inefficient. So Rachel, do you want to expand on your concept of local as a core for the microeconomy?
Yeah, well, I guess it's, I think this is a fantastic point, because it's, if we go back to the Greek ecos, that each household was self-sufficient, associated with a piece of land. And it's when the universal markets, or the land from elsewhere, or the products from elsewhere, start to intersect into that relationship, that we no longer become self-sustaining, and that the investment of us in the land, in the ground, in the place, in the kith that is, belongs to us, or we identify with, gets fractured. And so we're forever trying to fill that gap. And I think, and if we look at land ownership in this country, it is totally out of control in terms of its distribution. And it really cuts people off, in terms of being able to look after themselves, and being able to look after others, and being able to look after the land that looks after us. And so the kind of situation that John Clare found himself in, the Romantic poet, the peasant poet, whose knowledge was nature. It wasn't about a book. He actually understood the world by how he related, not just to his community, but actually the way things grew, how many birds there were, and what kinds of behaviors they got up to. That was the way that he understood a world. And when the Land Enclosure Acts came in, maybe not exactly direct cause and effect, but it totally disoriented him, and he ended up in an asylum. But you can imagine this, suddenly there are lines and borders that are fracturing communities, not just communities of people, but communities of creatures. And we see that in cities with skyscrapers, little birds trying to migrate from their summer home to their winter home because they've got to look after a family and stuff, and they run straight into a window. So these artificial borders and these separations horizontally from the ground that we live on, and vertically from these kinds of imaginary walls and spaces that have been constructed for us, I think that is something that we really need to rethink in terms of city, in terms of living together. And so the microeconomy grows from that.
Well, I can see one sort of vector towards that change, if it, albeit a slightly oblique one, through our current e-commerce's ability to depopulate our high street. If that's going to offer us a newly reclaimable space, like in the area where there was a shop there was a store there was a business there. We talked about our COVID transition, our COVID change to more working from home, which in itself might put more eyes on the problem. We would see more of our locale than perhaps we were the year before. But equally, maybe that makes some inner city office spaces untenable economically, and so that becomes a reclaimable space. I'm unsure of the mechanics beyond squatting and and this guerrilla activity at the moment. And I would love to think that we had a civics and a political elite or group that was willing to tackle that and take it on for us. But
I was going to add something on the ownership, because I think Majak is here, and Majak and I, funnily enough, we were neighbors. We were both property guardians for this property guardian outfit started by one of these hedge fund derivatives traders who probably wanted to have some goodwill back from his karma. But it was really interesting because he wanted to work with the creative community in London and get lots of different sorts of people. And we actually were growing our own fruit and veg on our terrace and trying to see how we could have different kinds of conversations. So I feel that there is definitely a lack of imagination in the different business models. The problem is in the UK, we have this landlord mentality, just exactly what you have online with the Googles and Amazons, because people want to own space. And I think what was interesting going back to Stephen's story, as well as Vaughan and George's story, is this concept of ownership has been challenged by how people have different relationships, whether that is with the cow in Jane's story, whether that's Mark and his grandmother and the town councillor taking the power back. And I'm just wondering whether we don't have enough conversations on the actual business model in the high street, because we're just talking about it as a place. But the place is driven by algorithms, it's driven by footfall. Majak here was working on, local footfall calculation. You can speak to him. But I think there's a lot of number crunching happening to make sure that this real estate is valuable. If we actually go into the concept of who is the landlord and what is temporary and what is permanent, and who actually is able to give back to an asset, which is what some of the stories try and kind of talk about asset ownership in a very different way, then I think we have really reimagined the usage of the space that we share together as a high street, rather than just saying it's another shop, another shop. You see what I mean?
That's brilliant. Yeah, I really do. I think that's great. The idea, I wrote it down, it isn't just a space. It is the operating system sitting on top of that space, and we do have a poor set of rules. I believe we have a poor set of rules, or maybe just a changing set of rules. Maybe there's new rules emerging in some of the tales we've been telling tonight, or will be in tales we tell yet to come. I hope so. But there's certainly the story of the business, then there's the story of the commons, and as much as the two might dance around each other, I don't think they're fully mashed together as any of us would quite like just yet. I'm loving the revolutionary overtones that tonight's fiction night has managed to lead itself towards. I don't think any of us were particularly expecting to go any other direction, but there we are.
Can I just comment on that? Because we always approach near futures with revolutionary directions, because that's what we're here for. But there is an element of gravity here, because these buildings on the high street, they're expensive to keep. So when retail withdraws, its security guards, for example, like when Marks and Spencer withdrew and took the security guards with them, the local high streets really suffered. So when we talk about Jane Jacobs and eyes on the street, these days it's more Marks and Spencer security guard eyes on the street. And when they go, there's a massive, massive hole that generally community cannot fill. And because of the police cuts in this country, nobody can fill. So a lot of the crime going up over the last 36 months, particularly since the police cuts were so severe, and the knife crime is clearly related to decline of retail and not being able to provide this security on the high street as we did before. With Top Shelf Arcadia, hundreds and hundreds of security people. So this is quite a big issue, because not only the buildings need maintenance, but the security needs maintenance. So I think I'm interested in your views, guys, on that future of the high street as the center for security, or lack of that center.
Wow. I'm going to pick up on that because I've been working in smart cities for a while, and one of the critiques of smart cities is it's empowered mass surveillance, or smart city can be seen as a route to mass surveillance. And indeed, if you listen to some folks from, say, maybe China or Korea even, they seem quite comfortable with that, and culturally they celebrate it and go, isn't it great, we can see using AI pretty much anybody who arrives in a city who isn't known from that city, we can identify that fact there's somebody we don't know within about 10 minutes. So, and they think that's great, and it's a different approach to freedom than we might have. Again, a story we've developed is the concept of playable cities, where rather than using technology just for surveillance, you use technology for culture creation and having fun with each other. So picking up on the kind of crime concept, one of the things we did here was we put cameras in 8 lampposts that projected down a performance space onto the pavements. And when you walked into the light, which was like a sort of drama light, it captured your shadow. And then when you walked through it, it played your shadow back to you. Now, we didn't tell anyone we'd done it. So at first, no one noticed. So it was like, bah, nothing happened for a few days. But then people began to notice, and it began to go around on Twitter and various, people who talk to other people. And within 2 or 3 weeks, people were going, geez, there's either demons got into these lampposts or something really freaky is happening here. And a wonderful story was a lamppost in a fairly poor part of town, where the kids came out and they worked out that something was weird was going on, but they got up the lamppost and stole the kit fairly quickly, and their mothers wrote to the council and said, we don't know what you did to that lamppost, but it was really fun, could you put it back? And we put it back, and we found that with mothers supervising naughty children, there was something like 30-40 kids out a night now doing dances into the light, playing with the light, because if you all put your arms in together and take them out, you create beautiful shapes. And we began to think about how could we use this digital technology for enjoyment, rather than, you know, there are plenty of people who want to use all of that digital technology for surveillance. So as you were talking, I just sat there, you know, with that story very much in mind, and have always been on the side of, like, we must use this technology for more than mass surveillance. I'm not sure that's a future that I particularly want to buy into.
Yeah, the current direction of travel seems to be the opposite, because the government, local government, is delighted to put more cameras to replace policemen who are expensive, and cameras are cheap like chips at the moment. So temptation to stick them on every lamppost and use them instead of human security, it's very, very high, and it's just going to increase because it's all processed on the cloud. So the actual cost of hardware is minimal. And that's always tempting for every small or wannabe dictator.
Yes, I mean, I agree with you, but I do understand that entirely. I think technology itself is neutral. It's a tool. It's up to us to shape it. And that's why I think we shouldn't just sit back passively and go, oh, isn't it terrible? Look at what they're doing with it all. I think it's up to those of us who are perhaps more creative and positive in mind to come with ways of using this technology that are beneficial to cultural development, rather than just being a sort of terrifying cyber security state. It's up to us to decide how we do it, a bit like joining maybe Stephen's town planner. Maybe, you know, it's up to us to shape the data. What's it for? But not, I have a horrible feeling it's inevitably coming. And thus, it needs shaping by us, not just putting our hands up in despair.
Again, I think the question for Priya, because you had a lot of goings on with local governments when you were working on Changify.
Yeah.
And the local government, in my experience, is very keen to help things out, but it always comes to the point, any money we have goes to adult social care, so leave me alone. And I completely understand that, but you were probably closer the most involved in trying to work with local government. What do you think is the possible angle that we can get them on board and not worried about experimentation?
I think that's why I keep pointing to Stephen's story, but I think the problem we have with local government and local democracy is, like, you know, every couple of years there's some change. Like when I was doing the Plymouth trial, it started with Tories, and then it ended up becoming with what was the UKIP party. And I had to meet all these councillors, and everybody had a different idea of what they would like to do for the town centre, even though the technology and the investment is longer than how long the particular that councillor would be there. So I feel it's almost like for us to have an idea that can help change some of these behaviors and bring new kind of, you know, like public commons that we've been talking about, you have to make it quite desirable and playful, like what Paul was saying, but also from a business model perspective. Like, unfortunately, politics is not going to give us the answer that we seek. It's going to be communities, it's going to be the shops, and it's going to be new business models. So I feel like the curtain twitching, you know, neighbors looking at whether you've gone out when there is a lockdown should be reutilized in a great way, where we can, you know, bring together some entertainment that needs to be had, and also work with the young, you know, people who become the future gang leaders, and really make this quite playful. I think we have to challenge some of these things. I just don't think we're having enough fun, you know, less curated fun, more what is actually happening.
You know, the interesting stats from the city that the most successful, you know, venues are pole dancing clubs and illegal brothels. So how far before we start bringing him to?
I wasn't so sure about the pole dancing, if I'm honest, but I like the idea of the fun.
So I put up the stairs
I
as
haven't seen
piano
some
link.
good ones.
Effort on my part, but you know, it's the idea that we would occupy or reoccupy these spaces, and you know, striking while the iron's hot, Priya, as you say, you know, the pandemic may well have given us an opportunity with extra eyes on our locale more than ever before to just show people that actually things can happen locally. But the very presence of kids playing with digitized shadows in street lamps meant that the storefront didn't need to be policed quite so aggressively because there were eyes on it. Have we looked at those kind of synergistic behaviors? And occupying is helpful.
I think we have to start bringing our conversation to a close because we're just about out of time. But I think can we possibly have each of the experts to comment how would they design a new town, because changing existing towns is really, really hard work. And in most of innovation, success comes from green pastures. So if you were given a nice piece of Milton Keynes sized land, Rachel, what would you do with it?
I would actually invite people that had no home to occupy the space, and I think that we would mobilize local knowledge and build community. I mean, I think everything is about shared space, and when we invest, the trouble is with cities is that we're able to ignore each other. Our technologies have taken us away from actually the difficult negotiations of having conversations and being nice to each other. We've lost that diplomacy. We can run away from it in all kinds of different ways, and it's that trouble of being together, not just people, but land, I think that we really need to fix. So if it was an open plot, let's make it a commons. That means everybody, bring people that don't have a home, and let's figure out how to make it work together.
Great. So you would support the Preston model because they've decided to go into micro ownership and cooperatives. Yeah, it's a very successful place and it works for them. Paul, can we have closing statements on what would you do with a patch of land of the size of Milton Keynes?
I joined a meeting that amazed me where Luanda is the capital of Angola, and they were creating a master plan for Luanda, and they the master planner for 2050 recommended no tarmac, and that all journeys would be done by either bicycle or on foot. And they were very keen to say that we're not here to create the problems of the last century. We're here to build a new city. And again, with Rachel's thing, that one of the things they definitely put in that whole master planning was public meeting spaces. And the great champion here is Gell, who wrote the book, the place between buildings and the creation of livable cities. And I think that reclaiming of, as Rachel says, the reclaiming of place, and I would argue that we built our cities for cars in the last 50 years. And to not do that would be remarkable, and to create places where we can meet each other. I agree, absolutely great. And I also think we will be using digital technology for fun to create entertainment, because one of the positive sides of digital technology is it's distributed, so we can all use it for participation.
Right. So before I move to Priya, can we just have a comment from George, if we can hear him, because he is actually living in Milton Keynes. So from the direct front line.
You have stuff like there are free to use ping pong tables that they've put in there now, and a giant chess set, things like that, which sort of encourage communal use of the space, even though on the one hand it is quite sterile because it lacks the sort of the traditional high street. It is more like an out-of-town shopping center in the middle of town.
Okay, very interesting. So you would have a sheep milk cart as opposed to milk cart going.
Yeah, I think
Jane would be delighted, I must tell her.
Yeah, I mean, it's I often go for a walk through along between the canal and the river, the Ouzel Valley Park, and they do graze cows there. So I don't see why. Being able to buy local cow's milk would be pretty cool. Or not in Milton Keynes, but there is a windmill in North Milton Keynes, and when I visited Nottingham a few years ago, there's a windmill there that you can visit, and you can buy the grain from there. And again, things could be tourist attractions and interesting parts of public spaces, but still also.
Can I pick up on it? Can I just pick up on it? Because that kind of sounds a bit brigadoon to me. We are very much from the position of declining environment where it's all kind of just make it pretty and small and tiny. You know, when you look at the growth of population, we have huge growth. Okay, Brexit temporarily closed it, but I'm sure it won't last very long. How do you go about the challenge of, you know, accommodating 3 new towns of 2 million each? I mean, this is really what the town planners have to cope with, because people don't want to live together anymore. I don't know why, but we hate each other and we all want individual households. So there's something like, I don't know, 100% growth over the last 10 years of individual households. So, you know, these are the things that we need to think about. And grazing sheep is great, but it's not going to produce enough homes for people to do what they want to do, which is everybody wants to live separate. So we have to kind of really embrace the growth, because otherwise it is brigadoon. So Priya, you are the growth girl. What would you do?
But I thought it was interesting from a planning perspective, and also taking inspiration from some of Rachel's points earlier about nature. I know that in Japan, they have used the slime mold for planning for the Tokyo map, and it came up with the most efficient way for commuting. So maybe what I would do if I was going to take over Milton Keynes is actually work together, like almost radical rewilding, like the next step, where you have the slime mold as a town planner, planning these roundabouts and planning the actual infrastructure, because they would come up with a much better way than we as humans in a top-down system would do. And they'll probably do it in a much more intuitive and low cost with a low carbon footprint, because you know how a slime mold moves. Like even the pigeons in Trafalgar Square, bloody hell, they know how to like use the M25 to navigate. I mean, that's not like, you know, a mean thing. So I just think we're not even looking at nature very well.
Amazing. Yeah. I think Ben has got a poll to share, just to wrap things up. So the final poll, Ben?
This is on our state of play as we wrap up this evening, the High Street Futures. Are you excited now for the future of your high street? Wholeheartedly, things will change for the better. Nervously, we see opportunities, but the path appears rocky. No excitement, just anxiety. It's a tremendous challenge. Or utterly despondent. Dystopia fiction has found itself a new see opportunities, but the path looks rocky. Fantastic. The answer I hoped for. So, glad.
So cautiously optimistic, and I think on that revolutionary note we will finish for today. But it was so wonderful to have this debate, and good luck to Paul, who actually has to deliver that in the day job, and to all the writers who have to keep challenging us, and Rachel and Priya who have to keep supporting the expert knowledge, the young and upcoming warriors, and to all the wonderful audience, Mark and Simon and Will, and everybody who put so much interesting stuff on it. We will save the chat and distribute it together with the blog from the event. So thank you very much all, and hope to continue that debate on next occasions. Pity we can't go to the pub, but thank you so much, guys. Thank you.